She wasn't famous. She wasn't wealthy. She didn't live a life that people would look at and think, "That's someone who needs to be careful." Nancy Guthrie was the kind of woman who brought casseroles to sick neighbors and remembered the names of people's children without being reminded. She was thoughtful. She was kind. She was, by every measure the people who loved her could think of, completely ordinary. And that, according to an FBI profiler who studied her case in meticulous detail, may have been exactly the point. Because when investigators began pulling the threads of what happened to Nancy, when they started laying out the timeline, mapping the geography, reconstructing the days and weeks that quietly led up to it, something emerged that didn't fit the pattern of random violence. Something in the architecture of it felt deliberate, considered, as if whoever was responsible had not simply crossed paths with Nancy Guthrie by accident, but had, at some specific point in time, made a decision about her, a decision that had nothing to do with chance. That word, chosen, changed everything. It shifted the investigation from a tragedy into something more difficult to hold, not just an event, but a process. And it raised a question that the profiler, with decades of behavioral analysis behind him, described as one of the most unsettling he had encountered across a long and complicated career. What was it about Nancy Guthrie, specifically, that made her the one? What did someone see in her quiet, unremarkable life that no one around her had ever thought to notice? The answers that eventually emerged were not simple. They were not clean. They pointed toward something far darker than anyone in her community had been prepared to confront, and they left behind a question that the people who loved her may never fully stop asking. Nancy Guthrie lived in a mid-sized town in the American Midwest, the kind of place that shows up in the background of people's lives rather than in the foreground of national headlines. Tree-lined streets, a downtown that still had a hardware store, and a diner where the same people sat at the same stools on the same mornings. Youth baseball leagues on Saturdays, the kind of community where people nodded at strangers and left their cars unlocked without really thinking about it, because the idea of real threat had never fully settled there. It was, by most definitions, the kind of town where nothing like this was supposed to happen. She was in her mid-40s when she disappeared. A mother, a part-time administrative coordinator at a local nonprofit that worked with families in financial crisis, people navigating eviction, job loss, the particular grinding shame of needing help. Someone who, by all accounts, gave more of herself to other people's problems than most people would consider sustainable. Not in a way that read as performance or self-sacrifice. In the quiet, habitual way of someone who simply didn't know how to look the other direction when she saw someone struggling. It wasn't a choice she made consciously. It was just who she was. Her husband, David Guthrie, described her to investigators as someone who trusted people instinctively, not naively, he was careful to say. She wasn't foolish about it. She simply extended goodwill as a default setting, and only revised that assessment when given a specific and undeniable reason to. It was, he said, one of the things he had loved most about her from the beginning. It was also, investigators would later suggest, something the person responsible for what happened to her may have understood long before anyone else thought to examine it. Her children were teenagers at the time, a son and a daughter, both still at home, still in high school, still in that particular stage of needing their mother in ways they probably couldn't have articulated even if asked. The household moved at the busy, slightly chaotic pace of a family with teenagers, school pickups, sports schedules, dinners that happened at shifting times depending on who needed to be where. A life that was full, even when it was imperfect. The kind of life that feels permanent from the inside. People who worked alongside Nancy at the nonprofit described a woman who remembered everyone's case details without looking at her notes, who stayed late without being asked and without making a point of it, who had a particular talent, rare and genuinely hard to fake, for making people in crisis feel that someone was truly paying attention to them, not processing them, not moving them through a system, actually seeing them. That quality, her colleagues said with unmistakable admiration, set her apart. It was also, they would later reflect with the particular weight of hindsight, very visible to anyone who happened to be watching from the outside. The investigation into Nancy's disappearance began quietly, the way these investigations almost always do in the early hours. A missing persons report filed by her husband on a Tuesday evening, when she didn't come home from work and wasn't answering her phone. By Wednesday morning, local law enforcement was interviewing her colleagues and retracing her movements through the day. By Thursday, the case had been escalated, and by the following week, an FBI behavioral analyst had been brought in, a development that, to those close to the family, communicated something they had been trying not to say out loud. This wasn't random. Someone official believed it wasn't random, and that belief was about to change the shape of everything that came next. For as long as the people who knew Nancy could remember, her life had been built on a foundation of consistency. Not the rigid, anxious kind, the warm kind. The kind that comes from someone who knows exactly what they value and has quietly organized their days around it. She had lived in the same house for 11 years, shopped at the same grocery store, took the same route to work most mornings, a 20-minute drive along a road that curved past a reservoir she had always liked. The kind of small private pleasure that becomes part of a person's day, so naturally it stops being noticed. Her routines weren't mechanical, they were chosen. The natural architecture of a life that a specific kind of person builds when they've finally figured out what makes them feel at home. Her friendships were deep rather than wide. A small circle of women she had known since her children were small, people who gathered every few weeks, who knew the full texture of each other's lives in the way that only real time and mutual honesty can produce. Her marriage, by the accounts of those who knew the couple, was solid. Not frictionless. No long marriage is frictionless, but fundamentally intact. To people who had chosen each other and kept choosing, year after year, without making a performance of it, that she had no known enemies. That particular phrase appears in the early investigative reports, and what's striking about it is not that it appears, it's that nothing ever arrived to complicate it. There were no estranged relatives, no bitter professional disputes, no history of threatening communications or restraining orders or incidents that, in retrospect, anyone could point to as a warning. Nancy Guthrie was not living inside a conflict. She was living inside a life that, from every visible angle, was entirely, quietly hers. And yet, there was something that investigators noted very early, something small and easy to overlook that would, in time, carry a great deal of weight. In the weeks before she disappeared, Nancy had mentioned to at least 2 people that she had felt, on more than one occasion, like she was being watched. She hadn't been alarmed when she said it, hadn't called it frightening, had, in fact, almost dismissed it herself in the telling, laughing slightly, the way people do when they're describing something that sounds irrational, but hasn't quite stopped feeling true. One of her colleagues remembered her mentioning it in the break room, something about the parking lot feeling different lately. A sense of being observed that she couldn't connect to any specific person or moment. Her colleague had said something reassuring. Nancy had nodded, moved the conversation forward, and neither of them had thought about it again, until they had to, when the FBI behavioral analyst was brought into the investigation, a profiler with more than 2 decades of case experience. Behind him, he began the way he always began, not with the crime, with the person, with the life, with the patterns that a life leaves behind when you look at it carefully enough. He reviewed Nancy's phone records, her emails, her work calendar, her financial history, her social media activity, the physical geography of her daily routines. He spoke at length with her husband, her colleagues, her close friends. He drove the route she took to work. He sat in the parking lot of the nonprofit on 2 separate occasions. Once at the time she would typically have arrived in the morning, once at the time she would typically have left in the evening, and he observed. He was, according to investigative reports, methodical in a way that people operating under time pressure rarely allow themselves to be. He was looking for something specific, and eventually he found it. According to sources familiar with the investigation, the profiler identified a pattern in Nancy's movements that was consistent enough to be predictable, but specific enough to require prior knowledge. The route she took to work, the timing of her lunch breaks, which varied by day but followed a recognizable rhythm, the particular side door she used to enter the nonprofit rather than the front entrance, a habit born partly of convenience, partly of preference, the kind of small behavioral detail that would be invisible to most people, but unmistakable to someone who had been watching long enough to notice it. What he reportedly stated next shifted the atmosphere of the investigation. This was not opportunistic. This was not a crime of impulse or proximity or wrong place, wrong time. What the evidence described was surveillance, deliberate, patient, sustained surveillance of a specific individual over an extended period of time. And that word, surveillance, carried an implication that couldn't be set aside. It meant that long before Nancy Guthrie disappeared, someone had already decided she was the one, had already been watching, already been learning her. The question that followed was the one that would define everything going forward. Why her? It was not, the profiler was careful to say, a question with an obvious answer. Nancy wasn't wealthy in any way that suggested financial motivation. She held no public position, no power, no influence. She wasn't involved, as far as anyone could determine, in anything that would make her a recognizable target. The selection criteria, whatever they were not immediately readable. And that absence of obvious motive, the profiler explained, was itself meaningful. When the reason isn't clear on the surface, he told investigators, you stop looking at what the victim had. You start looking at what the victim represented. The theory the profiler eventually developed, and it is presented here as theory, as a framework of behavioral analysis, not as established legal fact, with no official conclusion yet reached, was built around a concept that, once heard, is not easily set aside. He described a particular type of offender, not chaotic, not impulsive, organized, controlled, the kind of person whose actions are not driven by overwhelming feeling, but by a need to exercise power, and who experiences that power most acutely not in the act itself, but in the selection that precedes it. For this type of person, the profiler explained, the choice of victim is not incidental to what they do. It is the center of it. The deliberateness is the whole point. What this kind of person looks for, according to behavioral research in this area, is a specific combination. Accessibility, someone whose patterns are visible and consistent, who reads, from a safe observational distance, as unlikely to immediately raise alarm. Predictability, someone whose movements can be anticipated, whose daily geography can be mapped and memorized over time. And a particular quality of trust, someone whose natural disposition toward people would make an unfamiliar face, in a familiar context, unremarkable. Someone whose disappearance, in those first critical hours, might be absorbed by the people around her as a delay rather than an emergency. This is where the profiler's theory became, according to everyone who heard it in that room, genuinely difficult to sit with. Nancy Guthrie fit that profile in ways that were not coincidental. Her consistency, the same routes, the same times, the same side door used every day out of pure habit, made her movements predictable to anyone paying close enough attention. Her warmth, her visible openness, her natural tendency to engage with people rather than deflect them, made her accessible in a way that was simply part of who she was. And her specific role at the nonprofit, working daily with individuals in crisis, people who were often transient, often unknown to the wider community, often moving through the edges of formal systems without leaving much of a trace, meant that unfamiliar faces in her orbit were entirely ordinary. Nothing to note, nothing to remember. According to reports, investigators began reviewing intake records, visitor logs, and whatever security footage was available from the nonprofit building and its surrounding area. During the months preceding Nancy's disappearance, they were looking for someone whose presence had a pattern, someone who appeared more than once without a clear reason, someone who had, potentially, used the organization's services or its physical space as a way of putting themselves into regular proximity with a woman they had already quietly chosen. No official conclusions have been reached about what that review produced. The investigation remains active and ongoing, but the direction it pointed, the unsettling suggestion that Nancy's goodness, her openness, her genuine and deeply felt commitment to helping people in need, may have been the very quality that made her visible to whoever was responsible, was something the people who loved her found almost impossible to process, not because it implicated her in any way, but because it meant the best part of her had been turned against her, and that kind of knowledge has no comfortable place to live. There's a particular kind of grief that doesn't arrive all at once. It comes in waves, and some of the heaviest ones arrive not with the loss itself, but with the slow retrospective realization that there were moments quiet, forgettable, entirely ordinary moments when something might have been different, a conversation that could have changed a course, a detail that, seen in a different light, would have meant something. The people closest to Nancy Guthrie were living inside that grief, and they would be for a long time. Her husband David, in a statement made through the family's attorney, described what it was like to go back through the weeks before her disappearance and find ordinary moments that now looked entirely different. The evening she mentioned the parking lot, the afternoon she came home from work slightly quieter than usual, and said something vague about a man who had come into the office, someone who had made her feel, briefly, like he was paying attention to her in a way that didn't match the context. She hadn't filed a report about it, hadn't raised it with her supervisor, had done what most people do with discomfort that doesn't immediately explain itself, noted it, set it aside, and moved on with her day. Because that's what you do when you've been raised to doubt your own instincts. In favor of being reasonable, David's statement carried no blame. It was the statement of a man doing the only thing left, available to him, reaching back into the details because the details were all that remained of the days before. Everything changed. Her colleagues at the nonprofit were navigating something similar. Several of them, according to reports, had sought grief counseling in the weeks after Nancy's disappearance. The organization itself had reviewed its visitor protocols, its sign-in procedures, its internal policies around staff members reporting discomfort with specific individuals. These were necessary responses, important ones, but they arrived with the particular weight of institutional responses that come after the person they would have protected is already gone. The FBI profiler addressed this directly in conversations with the investigative team. He stated that the signs Nancy had perceived, the sense of being watched, the man in the office who looked at her too carefully, were not paranoia. They were not anxiety or imagination or social overcorrection. They were, in his professional assessment, the early signals of targeted surveillance, accurate perceptions of something real. The failure was not Nancy's. It was the culture's, the deep social conditioning that teaches people, and especially women, to rationalize discomfort into silence, to choose politeness over self-protection, to frame their own instincts as overreaction before they've even been tested. That conditioning, the profiler stated, was not a personal failing. It was a systemic one, and it carried implications that extended far beyond this case. Even with a behavioral profile constructed, even with a theory about selection and surveillance and the specific qualities that appear to have made Nancy Guthrie a target, the investigation had not, as of the time this story was examined, reached a resolution. No arrest had been made. No official conclusion had been reached. The case remained active, and out of respect for that process and for the family that was still waiting, certain details have not been made public. What has been disclosed, carefully and through qualified reporting, is the profiler's broader assessment, stripped to its core. It says this: the person responsible for what happened to Nancy Guthrie had almost certainly been present in her life, or close to its edges, for a meaningful period of time before she disappeared. They had observed, they had learned, they had chosen her not in a sudden impulsive moment, but through a slow, deliberate process that Nancy herself had begun to sense dimly, without being able to name it clearly enough to act. The profiler's theory also raises something harder to discuss, a question about the specific geography of danger. There's an assumption, common in communities like Nancy's, that quiet towns are safer towns, that a place where nothing bad has happened recently is a place where nothing bad is likely to happen. Investigators familiar with this case have noted that this assumption is not just incorrect, it can be actively dangerous, because it is precisely the atmosphere in which surveillance goes unnoticed, in which behavioral signals get rationalized as coincidence, in which the early warnings that exist in every case like this one, get quietly dismissed before they can be acted on are for the people who knew Nancy. The question of why her, the personal, specific version of it, may never fully settle. They knew her as someone whose qualities were entirely good, whose openness was generosity in its most natural form, whose consistency was dependability, whose trust in people was a deliberate choice, cultivated over a lifetime as a conscious alternative to suspicion. The idea that those qualities were observed and used against her, that the warmth they treasured in her was precisely what made her readable to someone